This morning, I am delighted to welcome Dr. Simidele Dosekun, who is Assistant Professor in the Department of Media and Communications, and she'll be talking about her recent book, Fashioning Post-feminism. After the talk, we hope to have time for questions at the end, so please write any that you have into the chat, and we will come to those. But for now, I'm going to hand over to Simi. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Okay, thank you very much, Louise, for the introduction and for organizing the event. And thank you to everyone for being here. I'm just going to jump straight in just because of time, because I know we're a bit constrained. So firstly, let me start by sharing my screen. Can people see the screen?
Yes.
Okay. So as I said, I'm just going to power ahead. Okay, so my talk today is entitled Spectacular Femininity, the Unattainable Standards of Post-feminism. And it draws from my recently published book, Fashioning Post-feminism, Spectacular Femininity and Transnational Culture. This is an image of the cover of the book. So Fashioning Post-feminism, the book, is about young, hyper-stylized, class-privileged women, Nigerian women in the city of Lagos, who dress in what I call, mostly descriptively, I call a spectacularly feminine style. And by this, I mean a style of dress characterized by the spectacular and even hyperbolic use of normatively feminine beauty technologies and accoutrements, such as false eyelashes, false nails, very long hair extensions, or wigs and weaves. Sorry, hold on, just putting on my timer. Heavy makeup, the highest of heels, and so on. Very much a style that I think from this very brief description, will probably be familiar to you. Part of my argument in the book is that it's by no means unique or delimited to Lagos, but rather that it's a transnational or globalized style that we see elsewhere. Certainly we see it in London as well. And we also see it very much in popular media culture. So the central question of the book is how does the woman in this style, who I call figuratively the spectacularly feminine Lagos woman, how does she see herself? As what kind of self, as what kind of woman? What kind of woman is she in her own view, in her own self-estimation? To try to answer, I conducted interviews in 2013 in Lagos with 18 women who self-identified as dressing in the style. And what I very much heard from them in the interviews is that by beautifying a woman and by feminizing a woman, again, in very kind of normative terms, individually and all the more so in combination, the different elements of their style of dress, so again, the makeup, the heels, the weaves, the false eyelashes, and so on, that these elements of dress promise to armor a woman and to bolster a woman. They promise to prepare a woman and support her to face the world, to walk with confidence, and so on. They argue, one woman sort of repeatedly said, you know, it gives you the style, or again, the different elements of the style give you that oomph. She kept saying that word oomph. So for example, this participant explained to me, she said, you know, I always tell my friends, and here she sort of, you know, paused for emphasis. So I always tell my friends, dress up for yourself. Make yourself, and she says, you know, not for your boyfriend, not for your husband, but for yourself. And, you know, she went on to explain that the kind of idea and the experience that she has is that if you wear something, if you dress for other people, so she says, you know, if you wear something and you don't feel you look good, other people will automatically feel that vibe about you, right? By contrast, referring to herself, she says, you know, when I dress up, I feel like I glow, I feel like I'm happy, I'm comfortable, I'm confident. Wherever I go, nobody can put me down. So again, this idea of that she's claimed that she very much tried to sort of impart that knowledge to other women, to her friends, and so on. So according to the women I interviewed, so again, on the one hand, they said, you know, the style sort of gives you this sense of confidence and empowerment and so on through beauty, essentially. But according to the women, to achieve this style, to successfully achieve it, to successfully embody it, to pull it off, to pull off the look, is not an easy matter. Not just any woman can do it. And therefore, not just any woman can access or benefit from the self-confidence and sense of empowerment that the style affords. And I mean, to think of this quote, you know, this quote on the slide again, this participant, part of what she was saying is that, you know, some of my friends don't know this thing about dressing for yourself. So that's an example where, you know, not just any woman can do it. Some women kind of need to be inculcated into the logics of the style and how to do it successfully. So again, don't dress up for men, but dress up for yourself to achieve the self-confidence. Other reasons why the women suggested that not just anyone can do this style or can pull it off include that, the style of dress is intricate, it's complex, it's expensive. Certainly for me in the interviews, hearing them describe their beauty practice, and also thinking of my pretty much non-existent beauty practice, like just hearing it was rather overwhelming for me. The extent of the kind of the labor, the time, the constant sort of vigilance, the expense and so on that went into appearing the way that they appeared. And the kind of day in, day out aspect of it, so spending 40 minutes every morning, for example, putting on your makeup, and then also spending a lot of time in the evening taking it off. So again, the dress is intricate, it's technically and even technologically complex, according to how the participants described it to me. And I argue also that it's physically and even somewhat psychologically risky to embody. So as such, in summary, the style calls for considerable material resources, it calls for technical and bodily skill, it calls for sheer labor and time, as well as a kind of watchful eye over, that a woman in the style has to sort of keep checking herself in the style to make sure she's sort of doing it well, to make sure she's not getting too attached to it, and so on and so forth. So again, not just anyone can do it. So putting all this together, I argue in the book that both for what the spectacularly feminine style of dress promises, and also for being the kinds of women in their own view and in their own account, being the kinds of women able to do the style and to pull it off, that the women in my research or in the interviews, that they see themselves as empowered. In fact, I argue furthermore that they see themselves as not only empowered in the style, but further self-empowering, again, precisely because the style empowers a woman, and again, does so by imparting self-confidence, which again, I think we can see those kinds of ideas coming through in this quote on the screen, as well as, again, this idea of empowering other women by imparting the knowledge. Let me give another, so I'm just checking the time, another example of this. So this is more this idea of like empowering, passing on the knowledge to other women. So there was one woman in one of my interview participants, and one of the 18, who very much, I would say the bulk of the interview was really less about her own dress practice, but more about how she intervenes on other women's dress practices, again, to sort of help them. And in particular, she talked about her colleagues at work. This woman worked in a bank, and there was very much this thing of like, I've sort of helped and trained and informed other women in the office, and I pull them into the ladies' room sometimes if necessary to basically kind of sort them out, help them out. And again, this idea of empowering them. So she told the story of a colleague of hers, a female colleague of hers, who she said, people in the office sort of knew that this woman was not the most self-confident woman. And she says one day this woman was told by their boss that she was that she was being sent to some public event to represent the company at a stand or something like that. And so this woman was very nervous about this. She, again, not the most self-confident woman, maybe nervous about public speaking or whatever it might be. So this woman, who I give her the pseudonym Funke, which is a Nigerian name. So she says, as this colleague of hers was leaving the office, she says, come. She calls her aside, pulls her aside. And she says she brings out her red lipstick. So this is Funke's own red lipstick from her bag, and says, I'm going to put this lipstick on you, to this colleague who's, again, going to this public event. So she says the colleague was hesitant. Oh, I'm not sure. I don't know about this. Is it going to look nice or whatever? And she says, no, don't worry. Just trust me. I know what I'm doing. So she says she puts the lipstick on the woman. The woman is happy with her appearance. She goes off to the event. And then later on, it's fed back to the office that, oh my gosh, she's doing really well. She's really happy. She's confident. She's representing the bank very well, and so on. So basically, it's a successful kind of experience for this woman. So Funke says, in telling me the story, she very much kind of ascribes this kind of almost this successful internal transformation of this woman, of this colleague, to the red lipstick, right? And the kind of the putting on of the red lipstick. So she says that the very next day, so this is the quote on the slide, she says the very next day, this colleague came back to Funke. I think she was going to the event again or something. So she said the very next day she comes back and she says, please, can I have that lipstick? Like I need that kind of empowering tool. So she says, so this woman, she took it herself, she applied it herself. So there's even a kind of shift here that she doesn't even need other people to apply it. I mean, not that applying lipstick is that hard, but again, that she's kind of taken on this kind of practice of self because of this new awareness of what it can afford her as a young professional woman. So she took it herself, she applied it herself, and she says, I don't care how much that lipstick cost, I have to buy it. And then Funke says, yes. I said to her, yes, I'll get it. I'll get a lipstick for you, right? So again, this kind of this idea of empowering other women through the knowledge, through the technologies, through the skill and so on of this spectacular and obviously highly normative feminine beauty practice. This same Funke also went on to say later in the interview, and I actually use this quote in my concluding chapter in the book. It opens the chapter, concluding chapter. She says, you know, I consider looking good one of the biggest or most effective pick-me-ups you can have. If you have somebody with self-esteem issues, she'd already given the example of that colleague as well as others, or who has issues with, oh, my husband is cheating or something. I mean, I guess this is, you know, there's some rhetorical kind of effect here. You know, I don't think the beauty practice presumably wouldn't literally solve someone's problem like my husband is cheating. But anyway, so, you know, if you have women, you know, these are like female problems, self-esteem issues, or my husband is cheating or something, start with a makeover, right? Again, as a route to kind of feeling better about oneself. And also, I mean, again, in a very kind of normatively feminine and female way, start with a makeover. There's nothing that can't be fixed with a little more happiness. So again, the kind of logic here being that a makeover, being fashionable, being beautiful, and so on, again, is precisely a kind of route to happiness, to female or feminine happiness. Okay, so overall, sorry, I feel like I'm rushing. I'm just quite conscious of the time, the brevity of the time. Overall, what we hear in these very few quotes that I presented, the kinds of logics that are underpinning them include ideas like beauty is power, which is, you know, quite a sort of common idea and common saying, and also the idea that beauty is empowering. And in this case, again, very kind of normative feminine beauty. I argue that there's also considerable individualism in them, in the sense that the idea that for a woman to empower herself is a matter of kind of working on herself, potentially with friends or, you know, again, being kind of advised and guided by others, but that there's something very much about sort of doing it for yourself, and also doing it very much through consumer culture, right, and through commodities and so on. And again, the idea of, you know, for a woman to kind of feel good about herself and gain self-confidence and empower herself and so on, is a matter of having the right tools and the right disposition. So, you know, get the makeup, get the lipstick, know how to use it, believe in yourself, do it for yourself, not for your husband or whoever, and go forth into the world kind of with the empowerment and the self-confidence that ensues. So I argue in the book that these are very much post-feminist ideas or sensibilities, and certainly I also argue that they're very much neoliberal ideas. So very briefly, post-feminism is a concept that feminist scholars have elaborated to describe a certain cultural moment and cultural sensibility from about the 1990s in the West, when in particular through popular media and consumer culture, women were being told, or, you know, women of particular types were being told that they were essentially past or post the need for feminism. So the idea, as I describe it in the book, the idea of being already empowered, free to make one's own way, past problems like sexism and so on, right? Scholars of post-feminism understand it, again, as I've already said, as very much a neoliberal sensibility, and also very much market-oriented and market-centered, and also highly consumerist. So meaning, for example, that women are invited to be entrepreneurial subjects, to work on themselves, to treat themselves almost as one would a business or a brand, and also to look to the market and to look to consumer culture, again, for solutions or for the things or the tools and so on that they might need. In the literature, it's also very much argued, and I think we see this certainly in popular media texts around us, that post-feminism, part of what it involves and certainly part of what it looks like, includes an intensification of feminine beauty standards, among many other things. So, you know, an intensified attention to the female body and so on, but all this done very much in the name of individual choice, self-pleasing, empowerment, and so on. So, you know, this idea that women are not objectified, but women are, you know, this idea of women doing it for themselves, you know, because they like it and so on. So this is just an image from Keeping Up with the Kardashians. I guess it's a promotional image of that reality show. And I'm just sort of putting it here as, on the one hand, an example of what the kind of look that I was studying in Lagos sort of looks like, but also, you know, as an example of a kind of what is considered an exemplary kind of post-feminist text. So, you know, exemplifying notions that gender equality, again, is already attained. So ideas of girl power, and that these ideas are synonymous with and are achieved through, in this case, luxury consumption, the cultivation of a fashionable self-image, a kind of immaculate femininity in terms of appearance. and very much a kind of hyper-consumerist culture and practices of self. Okay, so I argue again in the book, hence the title of the book, Fashioning Post-Feminism, that what my research participants or the women I interviewed, that what they're doing or fashioning or performing is post-feminism. I mean, there's more to it than that, but that's kind of the sort of summary argument. And in making this argument, part of what I also argue in the book is that post-feminism circulates globally, in particular through media and consumer culture, including quite literally through texts like Keeping Up with the Kardashians, which can essentially be watched. I mean, I know the show I think is over now, but can be watched or can be seen pretty much anywhere in the world. And so when I began my research, so this began as my PhD in 2011, there was an assumption in the literature, the existing feminist literature on post-feminism, mostly an uninterrogated assumption that the culture or the sensibility was basically for white women, or at the very least for Western women. So again, for women like the Kardashian, types like the Kim Kardashian and her sisters, also the kind of Sex and the City types. So if you think about that show, which incidentally is kind of coming back, I guess, with a new film, that the types of women who could afford the kind of fabulous, carefree, consumerist lifestyle, the intense fashion and beauty practices, who could sort of be invited to see themselves as, again, post the need for feminism, post empowerment, so again, already empowered. And part of the logic in the literature, or part of the assumption, is that the need for empowerment, feminist empowerment, has been displaced to others elsewhere. So the idea that, in the West, women are past feminism, it's women elsewhere in Africa or Muslim women, who need feminist empowerment and feminist liberation. So my argument, and for me, I think I think, and I thought at the time that it was a fairly obvious one, in large part, maybe because of my own positionality. So for those of us who, I don't know, in the audience who come from the Global South, part of my argument is that actually, of course, they're materially privileged women in the Global South as well, who are able to buy into and adopt the kinds of mentalities and practices of self that post-feminism precisely proposes or even sells. I also argue that to the extent that through the development industry in the Global South, in particular, through that industry, notions of women's empowerment are increasingly, or have become increasingly, precisely about development. So about women at the so-called grassroots level, rural women who don't have access to formal schooling, women who are outside the formal economy, women who need microcredit, and so on. So this is just, again, an image which I took from CNN a few years ago. So this is a kind of quite common representation of an African woman who, according to the caption on CNN, she's taken advantage of a microfinance loan. She's quite happy about it in terms of how she's represented. She seems to be a seamstress or something like that, right? So my argument is that if this is what women's empowerment, or the need for women's empowerment, looks like in the Global South, again, particularly through the development industry, that implicitly, by omission, these kinds of logics position the kind of women in my study, namely urban women, highly educated women, highly privileged women, highly cosmopolitan women. Implicitly, they get positioned as already empowered, or, again, post-empowerment. So here's just a visual kind of representation. So this is a woman, Larry Da Silva. She's a well-known, very kind of elite fashion designer in Nigeria. So, so she's a Nigerian woman, a Lagosian woman. So I just use this image and, compare it to this one to sort of, I guess, visually kind of represent the point that, my project is about these kinds of women, right? So again, privileged women, spectacularly kind of consuming, women, professional women, and educated women, and so on, who, again, I argue, have access to and can take up and can make sense of the kind of happy promises of post-feminist culture. So again, I argue that post-feminism travels. The final thing that I'll just say, yeah, that's my final slide. So the final thing I'll just say, I'll just go back to this first slide, because the title of my talk is Spectacular Femininity, the Unattainable Standards of Post-Feminism. But I think in what I've said very quickly and very briefly, I've argued that the women in my project sort of see themselves as post-feminist subjects. They certainly see themselves as successfully attaining and embodying and practicing this kind of spectacular fashion and beauty standard. So I just want to say a few words on the kind of the unattainable aspect of the whole thing, having perhaps suggested that in fact it is actually attained by the kinds of women in my project. So I argue in the book that actually, so on the one hand, the women kind of take up these kind of happy positions as, again, empowered, self-empowering, fabulous, doing it for themselves. One thing I haven't said is that they also sort of very much said, I pay for it myself as well. So, I'm not sort of funded by men in general, but also in this kind of spectacular beauty practice. So I argue on the one hand, that, the tone of the interviews was very sort of happy and celebratory and can do. But I argue that in the detail of a lot of what the women said, and sometimes quite explicitly, there was, unsurprisingly, also a lot of contradiction, a lot of ambivalence, sometimes even melancholy about what they were saying, about the kinds of ideas and practices of self to which they subscribed. I argue overall that the women's beauty practice doesn't live up to its promises, that red lipstick is not actually enough to empower a woman, whatever empowerment means, or to make her feel or be self-confident. I argue that, and then also, as I've already sort of briefly suggested, that it's also a lot of hard work to even kind of do the style and take up and enunciate and insist on, again, the kind of happy rhetorics of the whole thing. So I argue that, like feminine beauty itself, the confidence that this mode of self-making promises the women in my project who subscribe to it. Like feminine beauty itself, the confidence that feminine beauty promises, in fact, is very tenuous, it's fleeting, it's belabored, it's in need of constant reiteration and effort and vigilance and sweat and so on. More problematically, I argue that the promise of feminine beauty, and again with this, the promise of feminine self-confidence, obscures and thereby reinforces the patriarchal terms and conditions of the entire thing. So I argue that the content of the promise of post-feminist self-confidence is for women to feel better about themselves, to feel self-possessed, to feel powerful under and despite hostile cultural conditions that precisely tell them that they're not actually good enough or beautiful enough or deserving of self-confidence or whatever it might be. But so to achieve the self-confidence, women are essentially called on and exhorted to sort of better conform to those conditions, and thereby to contribute to the kind of perpetuation and normalization of them. So again, the idea that I feel good when I put on makeup, and therefore I'm going to keep on putting on makeup, as an invitation to essentially not question or resist or critique or complain about the very need or putative need or perceived need to put on makeup in the first place, if you see what I mean, right? So essentially my argument is that rather than, that the invitation of post-feminism to women is basically to better comply with patriarchy, rather than to refuse, to critique, to complain, to question, and so on, overall to adopt what I would very kind of liberally and loosely call a kind of feminist politics. And especially feminist politics as a kind of collective politics, as opposed to the individual self-making that very much comes through in what the women said. Okay, I'm going to stop there. I think we have about 5 minutes left. Thank you.
Thank you, Simi. Yes, plenty of time for questions. Can I just ask, you said you started your research back in 2011. Do you know, or have you noticed, in doing publicity back in Nigeria, if there's been any change in the women's attitudes, or does the spectacular femininity continue much in the same way?
Yeah, thank you. Yes, I mean, yes, the project has been a long time in the making, and I'm certainly, for a project about fashion and style, I've always had this sort of concern, particularly before the book came out, that like it's no longer even fashionable, or that the style has sort of moved on. But in my view, in terms of how this kind of demographic of women dress in Lagos, I think the style is still popular. Perhaps there's been a bit of a shift away from weaves and wigs towards natural hair in Nigeria, but also elsewhere in terms of Black women's stylization, also in the global North. But one thing that I would also say is that, so when I was actually in the final year of my PhD writing up this project, which was 2014, so, I was writing this thing, post-feminism, this idea of feminism as being kind of obsolete and so on. And then, I joke about this all the time, and it's also in the book. I think in late 2014, Beyonce then sort of performs at the MTV Awards, Music Awards, in front of this big sign saying feminist. So literally in the last few months of my project, I had this mini panic of, oh my God, feminism. I mean, obviously it's a good thing, but like this idea that there's actually a cultural shift that's actually ongoing anyway. A certain sort of move away from post-feminism, the feminism, certainly the word feminism and certain kind of feminist rhetorics have kind of come back in a certain sort of way that I feel was different from perhaps the moment that I was looking at in my book. So I do think that there's been a shift in Nigeria, certainly, also in the global north, where there is more talk of and more visibility around feminism. Although I do think, and Sarah Benet-Weiser, who has just left the LSE, has also written about this. You know, she describes this as a kind of shift to popular feminism. So I think there are questions that we could ask about what exactly is the content and the nature of this kind of renewed feminist visibility and audibility. But certainly, I think there's something that's a bit different from maybe the early 90s to the kind of 2010 type of period that perhaps my project was kind of looking at.
Yeah, really interesting. Thank you. There's one question in the chat from Helena Vieira. She says, would you say that women dress up for other women, meaning afraid of criticism from other women?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, yeah, yes and no. So I mean, you know, as I sort of said very briefly, the women very much said, this is not about men, right? And part of why they said that was because, of course, there's often a kind of normative assumption that if women are dressing up and making themselves kind of beautiful, again, in very normative ways, that it's about a desire for heterosexual attention and to be attractive to men. So when I say that, I'm often asked, you know, when I present the work, you know, I'm often asked, well, and people often say, especially students often say like, oh, don't you think that the women were basically sort of fooling themselves? Like this idea of like, I don't dress for men, I dress for myself. Like that's a lie. And I suppose for me, part of my response is that I think it's a false binary anyway. So I think, yeah, I think all of us, we dress for ourselves, whatever that means. But of course, we dress in a social and cultural context. And for the most part, we comply with kind of norms of dressing. So I think it is always, yes, perhaps for an internal gaze, but also external gazes as well. And I think certainly, as I think that maybe what this question is suggesting, there a lot of the women did say that, you know what, it's actually other women who will kind of scrutinize you more closely, right? And say, oh, that hair or those, you know, those shoes or whatever it might be, right? In a way that they sort of suggested men perhaps are not as attuned to the detail of it. But none of them said that they dress for other women. It was still very much this idea of for myself. There was one woman who said, even if I don't leave the house, even if I'm not going out, I'm not going to be seen. I want to see myself in the mirror looking a certain way because it makes me feel good. So I do it for those reasons.
Thank you. And we've got a couple of quite big questions coming in, only a minute or so left, but so I'll read them both out. One is there a way out of this mysterious circle, how to gain enough confidence in this kind of environment without complying to the makeup rule? And the other is about recommendations for future research in the area of post-feminism or feminism from a transnational approach.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, two very big questions. So the first one, is there a way out of this mysterious circle? I mean, I don't know if there is. I'm searching for it myself, right? I mean, I suppose what I would say, and it's sort of the last point I was trying to make, is that, I mean, certainly in terms of my own feminist politics, I guess I'm interested in kind of critique and refusal, you know, as opposed to just kind of complying. Having said that, of course, we all comply with beauty and other kind of gendered norms in different ways. So it's not to kind of suggest some kind of virtuous and external feminist position that is like above or superior to all these things. Of course not. But I suppose, yeah, again, I suppose I'm interested in, or I would sort of advocate a kind of a politics that's about questioning, where do these things come from? Why are they required? Why the imperative to be beautiful in the first place for women, right? Or to look a certain way. What are the cultural conditions that tell women that they're deficient, such that we need to cover up our deficiencies, again, with makeup, so-called deficiencies with makeup or whatever it might be. For Black women, certainly in the project, very much this idea of black hair as being, natural black hair as being deficient, so therefore you've got to wear a weave and so on. So I guess for me, the way out is to interrogate those things and again, to refuse them as opposed to comply. Tatiana's question, recommendations for future research. I'm not sure. Yeah, I'm not really sure what to say. I mean, I guess one thing is, I think there is still a lot of research on these kinds of representations and cultures and so on emerging around the world. So people are talking about post-feminism, but as I said, also like a certain kind of post-feminism and popular feminism, or whatever you want to call it, in different places around the world. So there's a lot of research on these kinds of new femininities in the African context, in the Asian context, and so on, as well as in the global north, that is ongoing. So yeah, I don't necessarily have any recommendations. The only thing I would say is, I mean, I'm in media studies, but I suppose I'm interested in questions. A lot of the initial work on post-feminism was on media representations, so again, Sex and the City, Keeping Up with the Kardashians, and so on. I'm interested in, and I think that it's very important, it's very valid. Certainly my work very much built on that. But I'm also interested in questions of how people on the ground, like, or the audience, if you want to call them that, how people kind of make sense of and live with not just the text, but the kinds of ideas and sensibilities that the media texts promote. So maybe that's one potential sort of approach for ongoing research, is talking about or looking at what a certain kind of media culture means in terms of how people actually live it or respond to it.
Thank you. And there is another big question about the environmental aspect. I don't know if you've got like a minute to stay on to answer that one, and then I appreciate other people might have to leave, but
yes. Yeah, so the environmental aspect, would you say there's a way to overcome this? Yeah, thank you. An excellent question, and very interesting and obviously very important. Yeah, so I mean, obviously, and I mean, not just the beauty practice, but just the kind of hyper consumerism of post-feminism, but also maybe just of our kind of broader cultural moment, obviously has massive environmental ramifications. So that perhaps is yet another reason to kind of resist and critique it. And then exactly as you say, there's the question of who does the labor, right? So one thing I didn't say in my presentation is that the women in my project very much spoke about, they were very transnationally mobile women. A lot of them had studied abroad, had done either university or sixth form and so on abroad. And a lot of them said, there was very much this idea of like, yeah, when I'm in London, then I can relax the beauty standards a bit. I'm kind of anonymous. But in Lagos, there was something about being at home and performing one's class position at home where the beauty practice became all the more intense. But part of that, which was said explicitly by some, but was also implied by others, was this idea that the labor is cheap. So this idea of like, yeah, in Lagos, there was one woman who kept saying, oh, I go to the beauty salon, I go to the hairdressers a lot. She kept saying a lot. So I eventually said, well, like, how much is a lot? And she said, like 4 times a week. And I literally, like, I often joke about this. I say like all my methodological training just went out the window. Because this woman said she goes to the hairdressers 4 times a week. And I just kind of went, whoa, I responded basically in a very kind of bad way, methodologically and ethically in terms of research ethics, with a certain kind of judgment and shock, right? But again, there's something about basically, yeah, because the labor's cheap, right? A woman like that, as privileged as she is, wouldn't go to the hairdressers 4 times a week in London. But in Nigeria, where we're talking about maybe £5 or $5 a pop, so this is sort of casual, taken for granted kind of beauty practice. So yes, certainly I think there's that question of who does the work, and also what is the experience of working on other women's spectacular, arguably excessive, supposedly empowering beauty practice. How does that position the beauty laborer? I think that's an interesting question that also needs to be explored.